James is going to do a review today. And eat some Canadian trout.
Canadian trout. Lake trout it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
And you're having some potatoes and tomatoes. And I'm having some potatoes, tomatoes, and some mushrooms, I think. Kind of grilled mushrooms.
Yeah, because you still had leftover.
Yeah, exactly right. I didn't quite finish. I put on sandwiches and stuff. That's a good word. So, what we'll be looking at is these are like two things that should have been taken into account a long time ago by the Fogoshes, and they weren't. So I believe this was published in 1995. Yes, 1995, paper edition. 1996, I got a paper edition here. And the Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy by Christopher Lash. And he was a professor of history at the University of Rochester. He died in 1994, so that was the same year that this was, well, it was actually a year before this was published. And then we've got, and these are roughly on the same topic, illiberal education. And I'd actually call it illiberal miseducation, but he's being quite kind actually in the title, because I'm afraid a lot of the stuff that's happening nowadays is just almost like thoroughgoing miseducation. The politics of race and sex on campus. Now this was put out by a dude called Dinesh D'Souza. There's a little picture of him, and just a little bit of a reminder. Dinesh D'Souza belonged then, he might still, he's still alive, he looks pretty young there, probably still is alive, to the American Enterprise Institute. If I say some approving things of what Dinesh D'Souza has to say, that's by no means an approval on my part of the American Enterprise Institute. Got that straight? Yeah. Please keep it straight, okay? I'm no fan of the American Enterprise Institute, or institution, or whatever it is. So, Illiberal Education was put out in 1991. We're going through the 30th anniversary of its initial publication, 1991, 30. And the stuff that Dinesh D'Souza documents in this book has gotten worse. It's not the same, it's gotten worse in the intervening generation. Unacceptable. This guy's documenting some stunningly stupid things. Like, you know, like, what was it that I think Gloria Steinem espoused it? She might have actually come up with it. I put it in terms of, what's sauce for the goose? She didn't say this. Is sauce for the gander. The whole idea, with her idea, is you take a situation and you reverse roles. With the stuff that she'd be concerned with, it's sex roles. And then you see how ridiculous it is. Okay. So I believe it's in this book. Dinesh D'Souza talks about someone, it might have been him, attending a class in women's studies. This is 30 years ago. And there was one person in the class who was making fun of guys losing their genitals, having their genitals cut off, and stuff like that. There was no challenge to it. There was no reprimand. This, folks, is hate speech. And, you know, like someone should have at least called it down. Now, hate speech that has to be controlled is stuff that encourages people to be killed or wounded or maimed. And this is kind of like that, making jokes about guys getting mutilated and things like that. I just kind of think it's one of the types of speech that I think, one of the few types of speech I think, that should be controlled. And there, of course, was no control. You reverse it. And
well, just by shaming. It should be controlled by shaming the person.
Well,
really, like
when it's actually, you know, like encouraging people to be killed for the way they're born, or maimed because of the way they're born. I think that's going too far. I don't believe in censorship, but when you got people making jokes about it, that's gone over the line for me.
All right.
But you know, like if it's joking, maybe. You know, like as far as I'm concerned, like putting a fatwa out or a contract out on someone should be a serious felony.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
The joking about like putting a contract out, I don't know. I'm not so sure. You know, like I feel somewhat ambivalent about that. So I can see what you're saying. You know, like I don't.
Well, I can see what you're saying too. I mean, if people are joking about it, then somebody who's serious about it could say, "Oh, I was just joking."
Oh yeah, and so that's what Rat Stevens did, otherwise known as Joey Surrender or Joey Submission. For those of you who can't figure things out, that's Cat Stevens. So he said some horrible things about Salman Rushdie and what should be done to him and what he'd do to him if he were had his druthers or the chance. And it was on TV, as I recall. It was definitely recorded for posterity. And you know, he should have been sent to jail for that sort of talk. You can't be talking that way. Saying that you'd go and, you know, I think it was if Salman Rushdie were getting burned, he'd be going and getting logs to put on the fire and stuff like that. Now his story is, he was joking, but he makes perfectly clear that, you know, like he doesn't believe in vigilante type of action, but where that is a law, like death for blasphemy, it's perfectly okay for that to be carried out. Fact is, it's right. He recognizes Sharia law says that it should be death for blasphemy. So that would be shortlisting the stuff, dissing the prophet, the seal of the prophet Muhammad, dissing his book or his recitation, the Quran, dissing stuff that's based on his life, his deeds, and his saying, the Quran, the Sharia law, dissing that's blasphemy. And dissing Allah, the God, and dissing Islam. So that's a short list. There might be other things, but it would include all of them. So, yeah, he recognizes that. He recognized back then, and he recognizes now that that's the actual Sharia law. And that's for believers and apparently non-believers alike. Like Salman Rushdie, I don't think he's a believer. He might have been raised in that tradition. I think he came from Pakistan or was born to Pakistani parents. Back then, when the fatwa came out, I believe it was February the 14th, 1989, compliments of the then Ayatollah Khomeini. There were lots of demonstrations in England and things like that. I think maybe 30,000 people turned out in Bradford and over Leeds. And I think they were all crying for Rushdie's head. So I don't think there were too many supporters.
Flies love the smell of trout.
And there were people, of course, crying for the blasphemy laws in England, which apparently were still on the books and maybe still are, that they be invoked. Hey, the blasphemy laws in England would be there to protect Christianity. As far as Christians are concerned, to say that God has no son, as you find in the Quran, and that Jesus was it's repeated, it's a refrain in the Quran, Jesus, son of Mary. That's emphasizing that he's not the son of God. Now, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in blasphemy law. But, you know, like if Muslims want blasphemy laws invoked in England, I'm afraid the Quran would be considered, as far as Christians, blasphemous. Anytime it says Jesus is God has no son, or Jesus is the son of Mary, or Jesus was not the son of God. I don't believe in invoking blasphemy laws, but Muslims are yipping and yapping about invoking the blasphemy laws, which I suspect, although I'm not sure, are still on the books in England. They should just shut up, zip their lips about that.
Yeah, it's not in their best interest.
It's not. Now the penalties, I'd be very disappointed if they involve death or anything like that. I don't know if they'd even involve jailing, but there should be no penalties for blasphemy anywhere in the world, for anything. And that's for any religion or belief system. So you're hearing that, you commies out there? Someone makes fun of Lenin, you got to suck it up and take it.
Excuse me.
Of course you're not, because you know.
It was cucumber juice. Gets me burping.
Yeah. I'd better drink that. That's kale or cucumber?
Cucumber.
It's cucumber. Yeah, it's going to be tough.
I think it's easy. I love cucumber juice. James does.
I'm not a big fan. But it's quite, it's actually, this one's pretty good.
Maybe you've gotten used to it.
No, it's very thick. So there's he's documents stuff in here of how awful it is. And this stuff, especially with race, has just got out of hand, especially on campus. One of the things I kind of given a forewarning, foreshadowing what was to be found in here. You know, there's a whole chapter on affirmative action. When I first heard about affirmative action, I was a left wing. I heard it actually from a university prof who's very enthused about it. I don't know if he's a university prof back then. It was quite a while back.
Alfred, don't.
I was absolutely appalled. I was going, what? It was part of the Equal Rights Amendment or something like that.
Well, yeah, I wasn't. I didn't realize. You know, I thought, well, if it's necessary to get people into the workplace or whatever, you know, but now I realize, I mean, you can't get to a fair outcome by treating people differently. I mean, it's not going
depending on how they're born.
Yeah, it's
wow.
Yeah.
That's shameful.
It actually encourages racism.
Racism or sexism.
Yeah. Sexism.
Or it could be religionism or whatever you want to call it.
It's not. It's not a good thing at all.
It's awful. So, you know, at a lot of universities, they're still allowed to do it, even in the United States. They will look at representation at a university and say, oh, a particular group is underrepresented. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a particular group they won't do that with. You look at most universities nowadays, and are women or men in the majority?
I think there's women. There's a lot of women going
vastly
to
in the majority. Yeah. But you'd never see.
Well, they need it.
Admissions favor. Yeah, I know, but you'd never see admissions favoring men in those sorts of situations. So he starts off his chapter on affirmative action, talking about what's classed as Orientals or East Asians or something like that, and how they were complaining 30 years ago about getting hammered, getting huge SAT scores for trying to get into places like Harvard or Stanford. I think the example was Stanford. And getting hammered, and then blacks and Hispanics with much lower SATs being allowed in. And whites getting hammered, but maybe not as bad as the Orientals. Jews getting hammered, and I suppose they were classed as whites. The Europeans made the definitive choice, a definitive statement about whether the Jews were Europeans or not, and that occurred between roughly 1942 and 1945. And that definitive statement was a Holocaust. It wasn't just the Germans, it was the French collaborating, Hungarians collaborating, on and on it goes. They made the definitive decision. You know, since Jesse Jackson started yipping and yapping about, you're supposed to say African American and not black. That was a long time ago. I believe Denise D'Souza talks about it, so it'd be over 30 years ago. Jews, however, you know, this is too true to be good, are, let's call them, if they're in Europe, we'd call them Southwest Asian Europeans. If they're in the United States, Southwest Asian Americans. If they're in Canada, Southwest Asian Canadians. You know, it's like what Gloria Steinem said. You reverse roles or turn them around, right? They came from Southwest Asia. And that's not based on what they wrote about in the Bible and stuff like that. That's based on Assyrian stuff that used to be carved in stone until ISIS got hold of it, of these things, and blasted them to Kingdom Come in Nineveh, kind of like part of Mosul now. And you know, like there's stuff mentioned in at least one stele, Egyptian stele, Merneptah stele, and on it goes. So here we go, faux gauches. Don't be so faux anymore. You can still be gauche, at least on the left side. Don't be gauche in the other sense of the word, or one of the other senses of the word. Get this straight. Get this straight. Okay? Jews come from Southwest Asia. They come from Israel. Got that straight? Keep it straight, please. Quit telling the lies. I mean, you guys are like you think you're on the left wing, but you're really on the right wing. You just got a different right wing philosophy than Donald Trump. But you and Donald Trump are a bunch of hosebag liars. Stop it. Cut it out. You too, Donnie. Stop lying. Go to jail. Go directly to jail. Do not, what is it? Pass go. Do not collect whatever. So, Orientals are getting hammered. But this should have been the most important paragraph in that chapter, maybe in the book. He says, Orientals do in high school, and this is self-reporting, so you got to be a little bit skeptical. I believe it was 11
okay?
hours and change, okay, per week.
Okay.
And then whites, I think it was 8 hours and change per week. Hey, maybe that explains why SAT scores are, on average, much higher for Orientals than for whites. Now he says that the hours reported for blacks and Hispanics were significantly lower. I believe that's the term he used. Hey, This is important. Denise, buddy, if you decide to come up, maybe you have, but if you decide to come up with a more recent edition, you report what it is for the blacks and the Hispanics. It's important. I want to see if there's a linear relationship or something like that between time spent studying and SAT scores. You see, what's happening with this affirmative action, or was back then, and it's still happening now, I suspect, is, SAT scores were pretty well a direct reflection of amount of time spent studying. So admissions should have been based on equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. If you don't study as hard, if you're a whitey, and you don't study as hard as East Asian or Oriental, you shouldn't be allowed into prestigious institutions if you can't get the SAT scores. It's just equality of opportunity. If you don't put the time in studying, you shouldn't be allowed in. What guarantee is it that someone who hasn't done the studying in high school is going to be studying in university? So Denise D'Souza documents how there's this huge, or back then, I presume it's somewhat similar, huge failure rate amongst people who've been slipped in. They're not ready. And there's one thing about, there's this one, I believe is a black woman or Hispanic woman, complaining about hating whites, white guys, because they've always got their hands up and stuff like that. And she can't stand him. Well, she shouldn't be put in that tough situation. She hasn't done the preparation. So set up some remedial schools or stuff like that. They've got remedial courses. Hey, is someone swamped and you give them more courses?
No, well, he points it out. It's gotten worse. Now people just hire tutors, or they just get shuffled along. Well, they don't want to fail people, so they just, don't worry, you'll get through, and somehow they get through. I don't know.
So he does talk about tutors back then. Yeah, he's talking about rich people being able to afford them.
Yeah.
How did that help out George Bush Jr.? C average, apparently.
Yeah, he must have been with all the tutors. Really,
well, he's a lazy.
Yeah. Because he would have had tutors, and that's all he could pull off.
So,
So his test scores must have been like 0 to make up for the
hard to say.
That was getting done.
The reason why he got through, it's like one university prof I know said, well, that's a gentleman's D, what he got. Gentleman's D average. Because his dad would have, and granddad presumably, who both went to Yale, both were quite well off, would have been contributors to the Yale fund. Yeah, so they're going, okay, gee, it's so embarrassing, but no one will really notice if we give him extra better grade on his average. The D average flunky, let's give him a C, get him through. Well, I guess D's actually get you through, but it looks pretty undistinguished. So yeah, I mean that's I think all we'll have time to deal with this is the affirmative action, and it is horrible. You cannot in a democracy go selling affirmative action where you're giving favored status to minorities just because they're not performing well. They've got to learn to learn. And how do you do that? They found out with studies, well, they claim to have, one has to always be careful about studies. To get kids to do homework, you can have parents who don't even really know the language. They can't teach kids math. They can't teach kids the language. But what's important is that they sit down and read at the same time their kids are doing homework. The important thing is not the instruction at home, it's the value. It's valuable to sit down and read. So they're all. This guy brings up one example of a woman who got slam dunked, East Asian, Vietnamese, I believe, and she had a hard life. She barely knew English, I gather, when she hit town. Her parents, it was even worse, and yet she got pretty good marks, but it wasn't good enough to get into Stanford or wherever it was, you know. And it's you know, how bad her situation was, way worse than it would be for a black person or an African American. You see what I'm saying? They already know English. It's not standard university type of English, but it's not the same as coming from Vietnam. You ever looked at Vietnamese? Please, Fogocious, just look at it, please. Better yet, try to learn it. Try to learn it. Wacka languages. So you're not walking around in this swoon, you know. Try to study some history from some other places instead of going around, hey, you know, like, Americans were awful in Vietnam, and Americans were awful in World War II bombing. Hey, you know, like, there's a world out there besides America. And it's not just America stomping in here and stomping in there and stomping in everywhere.
You better eat your fish. They really want it.
Yeah, I know. So, yeah, I think I'll just call it quits there and eat the food before the flies eat it. But we'll be dealing with the revolt of the elites, too. Oh, yeah, it's awesome. These flies are awful.